Hi there, this is Dale Byron, and this is the Dale Byron Poetry Podcast, a fresh glimpse of knowing. Well, here we are at the third episode. I hope you enjoyed the first two. And of course, I'm delighted for you to be here today. I've decided to take on a 3-episode per month pace. So just about every 10 days or so, there'll be a fresh new one. Of course, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, then please subscribe, perhaps send along to others. You could even provide a comment or a rating through Apple Podcast or, of course, whatever app you might be using. Today, we're going to expand our poetry first aid kit, which is the way I think of it sometimes, with some poems and a few poetic aphorisms to help us unpack a very thorny issue and question. Will our democracy survive the political and social polarization that we're living through and have lived through for the last number of years? Now, that question, at first blush, seems like total hyperbole, total exaggeration, beyond the pale. But now I think it's a little different. I feel there are pressures on our nation, our culture, our democracy, our values. There are pressures now that we haven't known before. Now we need to find ourselves, I think, a nice, long, cool drink of hope to sustain our good efforts. Yes, you know what I'm going to say here. If you've listened to the first two podcasts, you'll know that I'll say now that poetry can help. And the title, which brings me to the title of this particular episode, the third episode, I'm naming it Enemy, One Day We Glimpsed Your Life. That's our title, which contemplates a new relationship with our fellow citizens, a new relationship and new possibilities. Now, the way of this podcast is to find poems that don't shy away, poems that have sharp elbows, in fact, can take care of themselves, poems that won't run away from trouble or troubling facts, poems that embrace both, poems that digest troubles and facts, hard facts, with poetic language and visions. Poems that do their best to fly up under the radar screens of our logical, linear minds directly to the heart, as we've said a number of times before. And once there in the heart, capable of sometimes great transformations and paradoxically unpredictable shifts that change everything. Well, as in previous episodes, we're going to start with some facts and contextual statements, the logical linear statements that help us get a handle on whatever issue we're working with. But first, I thought we'd get a quick taste, some opening lines of one of the poems that we're going to work with today that is called A Ritual to Read to Each Other. I just want to give the first 4 lines. This is a poem by the great poet William Stafford, A Ritual to Read to Each Other. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world. And following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. Now, even in those first few lines, and we're going to pick back up on this poem in just a few minutes, but can you, from just those first 4 lines, can you begin to feel what's at stake? What it might mean to follow the wrong God home, and how that wrong God may be some kind of demagogue that we begin to accept what they tell us, who to dislike, who to hate, who to not see as our equal. Okay, we'll get back to that poem. But back to our commitment to blend both head and heart, to blend the lay of the land, logical, linear facts, all of that together. That's our commitment in this podcast. Let's talk about some facts that I think are pertinent for this question we're asking today. And one of the things that I see, or that occurs to me, is that we've now had 3 generations, over these last years, 3 generations with 8 prominent anxieties. And one of those anxieties, I think, contributing to the difficulties, the cultural difficulties in our country, is we've had such cultural change. So there's cultural change anxiety. There certainly was what I call Vietnam War anxiety. Some of us old enough to have some memories of that when it was actually happening. Many not. The third kind of anxiety we could say is globalism anxiety, and what that actually means for so many around the world, in our country, the United States, but also in other countries around the world. Certainly there's been terrorism anxiety. Economic anxiety is a huge one. I would say social status anxiety and things changing and shifting. Certainly environmental anxiety. We talked about that in the first podcast with, healing our relationship with the natural world. So there's certainly been environmental anxiety. And also, of course, this last year and a half or so, there's been pandemic anxiety. So I think all of those are in the mix. And I also, in terms of having us, marinate in some prose and some logical linear facts about these times, I thought I would give some quotes by a writer and a scholar named James Hunter, actually a sociologist who, as far as I know, coined the word or the term culture wars many years ago and wrote a book by that same name. Well, here's a few quotes from James Hunter. He said, "The 60s revolution and the political, cultural, and sexual protests at the time essentially became institutionalized, and it challenged fundamental notions of what was right, decent, good, fair, and so on. And in a way, what you had in the late 1970s into the 80s and 90s was a reaction against the challenge represented by that structural change." Another quote from Hunter is, "The failures of Reconstruction and the emergence of Jim Crow and black codes And all of that was proof that politics couldn't solve culture. It couldn't solve the cultural tensions. And so what you end up with is a struggle for civil rights. Another quote, well, I'm going to sound really old-fashioned here, but I think that this work takes a long time and it's hard. That's the work that we're really talking about here today. Back to the quote. I think you talk through the conflicts. You don't ignore them. Don't pretend they don't exist. And whatever you do, don't just simply impose your view on anyone else. You have to talk them through. It's the long, hard work of education. Now here's a quote in this, in this number of quotes that I found particularly haunting. Culture wars always precede shooting wars. They don't necessarily lead to a shooting war, but you never have a shooting war without a culture war prior to it, because culture provides the justification for violence. Now, this gets back to the theme I was talking about, the question about what will happen now to our American democracy. And that quote sort of puts it in perspective, doesn't it? A couple of more quotes, again, linear, logical prose to get ourselves contextualized here. Hunter said it like this. He said, look, not to hope, to give in to despair is never an option, in my opinion. That's an ethical position I think one has to take. But I also don't think that you tell a patient that they have a bad cold when in fact they have a life-threatening disease. And then finally, he said, one of his quotes from the book, I have this old-fashioned view that what we're supposed to do is to understand before we take action, and that wisdom depends upon understanding. Okay, well, this theme we'll get back to today. The first full poem I want to talk about is also a poem by William Stafford. It's called For the Unknown Enemy, and it goes like this. This monument is for the unknown good in our enemies. Like a picture, their life began to appear. They gathered at home in the evening and sang. Above their fields, they saw a new sky. A holiday came and they carried the baby to the park for a party. Sunlight surrounded them. Here we glimpse what our minds long turned away from. The great mutual blindness darkened that sunlight in the park. And the sky that was new, and the holidays. This monument says that one afternoon we stood here. This monument says that one afternoon we stood here letting a part of our minds escape. They came back, but different. Enemy, one day we glimpsed your life. This monument is for you. Enemy, one day we glimpsed your life. This monument is for you. That's William Stafford, and that poem comes from a brilliant collection of poems called Every War Has Two Losers. And I would highly recommend you seek out that volume of poems for this poem and many others. So I was thinking, as I read this poem, and the kind of shift it does in our thinking. We're not used to thinking about seeing the good, the unknown good in our enemies, which this poem is dedicated to. I was thinking about a quote from another amazing poet, Goethe, who said, "Divide and rule," the politician cries. "Unite and lead" is watchword of the wise. Also, the brilliant, amazing Eleanor Roosevelt once said this: "Pit race against race, religion against religion, prejudice against prejudice. Divide and conquer. We must not let that happen here. Divide and conquer. We must not let that happen here," said Eleanor Roosevelt. In sniffing out quotes by amazing poets and other amazing human beings, I found one by the poet Maya Angelou, and she said it like this. She said, "In the 16th century, Machiavelli, in an attempt to get back in the good graces of the powerful, wrote a slim volume called The Prince. In that book, he showed the powers that be how to control the people. That book is a statement: separate and rule, divide and conquer. That's 500 years ago, and it still works because we allow ourselves to be led around with holes through our noses." If you study this question about one of the reasons or why, or begin to think about healing the relationships between citizens of this country, this nation, you can't help but see that all roads lead to this notion that power often is derived by pitting one group of people against another, so that they have no time to look and see what might actually make their lives better together, collectively together. Well, William Stafford also had a few other quips, wonderful aphorisms, which I call poems with bib overalls on. He said, "Between roars, the lion purrs. Between roars, the lion purrs." And you see that even in difficult times with fierce beings, there are those interims where peace can break out. He said another few things too. He said, "Politicians need citizens who will permit them to behave reasonably." Have you noticed how in our more and more contested sort of cultural environment that it seems though we're, if politicians, certain ones, certainly not all of them, but certain ones and certain powerful people have pitted groups of people in our country at each other's throats, then you also see that once that occurs, it begins a nasty kind of feedback system where then the citizens demand that the politicians be unreasonable as well. I think that's what Stafford was talking about. And then one more by Stafford. "Those who champion democracy those who champion democracy but make a fetish of never accepting anything they don't agree with, what advantage do they see in democracy? Now, do you begin to see how these logical linear assertions pair up with the images and the sounds in that poem? I just love those last few lines. This monument says that one afternoon we stood here, letting a part of our minds escape. They came back, but different. Enemy, enemy, one day we glimpsed your life. This monument is for you. Now, of course, at the very heart of this podcast is the notion that if we can marry the facts, the logical, linear, the data, the empirical facts, if we can marry those with the visions that come out of poetry, with the metaphors, the sounds of the words themselves, if we can marry those things together, then we have a much better chance at actually motivating, maybe would be a good word, ourselves to have the resiliency to take the steps each day we need to take. I sometimes think, I said that we need a fresh dose of hope at the beginning of this podcast. But sometimes I think that there's only one thing better than hope, and that's commitment. I love, there's a quote somewhere that says, if the things you want to achieve in your life, if they can be achieved in only one lifetime, wow, the goal, the vision is too small. Okay, let's move on to the poem that I kind of teased at the outset of our episode today. That poem, again, that I mentioned is called A Ritual to Read to Each Other. And I think it is so pertinent, so timely for the subject we're talking about reimagining our relationships within our own country, the relationships with our fellow citizens. A ritual to read to each other. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break. Sending with shouts, the terrible airs of childhood storming out to play through the broken dikes. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel. I call it cruel. And maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake. or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. Should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. Should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. You know, recently I saw unfold in a very interesting place, maybe an unlikely place. I participate in a social media. It's business-oriented social media that many probably participate in or know about. It's called LinkedIn. And I tend to gravitate toward a lot of people that are working on progressive issues. And of course, you know, business is the backdrop as well. And there was somebody who had put a post on there about a billboard. And in effect, it was racist, is what it was. The long and the short of it is it was racist, and it was done in subtle and not so subtle ways. And I'll just tell you that much because I think that's enough context to sort of get the story I'm going to tell you now and finish. So the person that put it up said in no uncertain terms that they thought it was racist and demeaning and that sort of description, and was using it as an example of where oftentimes there's a kind of racism without maybe even a full awareness of it. Anyway, a person wrote in early on, there was a comment, and the person said, obviously you knew was going to disagree and say, no, I thought this somehow or another, this billboard or the statement on the billboard had some merit to it. And the person said, I know, in other words, they're writing this comment and they're writing it to the person who posted it, saying to them, I know you are going to drag me through the mud, ... And then made the comment about, here's why I think some of the stuff on the billboard makes sense and is correct. The person that had posted it put an answer on. They said, no, I'm not going to drag you through the mud. That was the first line in the answer. I'm not going to drag you through the mud, and I'm not going to let anyone else do that as well. But I am going to ignore your provocation here because it isn't honest. You know full well, the person answered, that in this case, rising out of poverty, which is essentially what the whole thing was about, rising out of poverty takes more than getting a good mentor when the system is mostly set against you. Well, now I've given you a little more context about the subject of this, but my main point is that I thought it was a brilliant answer. I thought it was a respectful answer, which both said, this is how I feel, and no, I am not going to abuse you or drag you through the mud, and no, I am not going to let anyone else on this posting get by with that either. And I got to tell you that having studied the martial art of Aikido for many, many years, that demonstration was some of the best Aikido, which is Aikido, is the martial art of trying to create peace, which in Aikido it says, I will not hurt you and I will not allow you to hurt me. So this poem from William Stafford, I think, is really speaking about not allowing ourselves to be pulled and tugged apart, to be pitted against one another. That if we allow someone else to use emotional tugs, issues, to pit people against one another. He says it so well. He says, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world. That is a pattern to keep people fighting each other, to keep people struggling and fighting each other, pitted against each other. And the metaphor he uses, I think, so powerful. And following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. Well, I think that how could we see our current contemporary political and social landscape in many ways and not believe that we are missing our star, that we are being pitted against one another. Now, I just want to say, I have no pipeline to the truth when it comes to human relationships, and especially to healing relationships that have developed and devolved into a very difficult we and they. And there's no getting around it. That's what's happened in our country. Even the wisest poets, I would also say, are left stumbling along on a path when that path is as complex as human relationships. However, their poetic stumblings can help us create the context for healing even difficult relationships. And here I mean the images and the stories and the visions, the pickle juice, if you want a more down-home metaphor, to help us get along a bit better. Remember again William Stafford's words, those who champion democracy but make a fetish of never accepting anything they don't agree with. What advantage do they see in democracy? The truth is, if we look at all of this, what real choice do we have? If we love this country, if we love this land, this country, what choice do we have but to take one step at a time and try to move forward? I learned in Aikido the principle of what I might paradoxically name aggressive peace, which is when confronted with outright aggression, to take a stance of, I will not hurt you, nor will I let you hurt me. Or another way I think of it is standing in the fire of a temporarily broken relationship with the stance that says, I'm not running and I'm not fighting either. But to have the skill to be able to connect and to connect in such a way that begins to create a bridge. I am not saying this stuff is easy. I am not saying that I have any, as I've already said, pipeline to the truth. I just know that this effort is deeply needed. Let me finish with a couple of quotes, one by a wise thinker named Bell Hooks, the other by Andre Lorde, a poet. I'll do the poet first. She said, divide and conquer must become define and empower. Audre Lorde. The second one, Bell Hooks. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. Well, that's a wrap. That's a wrap. And I just want to thank you so much for listening. And of course, if you've enjoyed the podcast and feel it has value, I'd love it if you would give a rating there on the place where you get your podcast, Apple Podcast or wherever. And also you could leave a comment if you like. I always love it if folks send along to other friends and colleagues that they think might enjoy and get value from this work as well. That'd be great. Okay, well, that is a wrap. And until next time, next podcast, you take good care of yourself.